a number of the comments that I always get are, where is there any hope? How can we hope for anything here? And the answer to that is, um, stop thinking about individual crises. I mean, still participate in those. We need to protect our Somali neighbors. What the things that ICE is doing are unconscionable. All of those things are still there and must be combated. The bigger picture, though, certainly seems to be an executive branch that is increasingly just essentially saying F you to the American people. And the question of how elected Republicans and other people in the country will respond to that. And if you're an elected Republican, what does that look like? Trump is falling apart. Watch him. He is falling apart. He's under enormous stress. He can't stay awake in his own televised cabinet meeting. He's got incompetent people around him who are committing war crimes. And those Epstein files are, I believe we're 19 days toward the deadline of when those things have to come out. And a lot of people are like, well, they're not going to turn them all out. No, I feel certain they're going to do their best to hide them and to do, to redact them and do all kinds of stuff. But I keep saying to you, think of how many people have seen them and who can say, wait a minute here, I saw that document and what's missing from it is X. And a lot of them are not going to be willing to continue to cover up for people who are doing things like committing war crimes. So where you should get hope is the fact that we are watching this administration really sort of collapse in real time. I mean, it's a lot coming at us all the time, but it's in many ways fascinating. A lot of these storylines are sort of coming to a crashing end. But now, that being said, it's going to get really ugly. It's going to get really ugly before it gets better. So, all of those sayings about, narcissists ending up in madness and, the dying mule kicks hardest and a cornered rat bites and all that sort of thing. That's what we're going into in December, January, February. We're going into this crash between the executive branch, members of Congress, if they stand up to it, and the American people. So I'm not saying it's time to pop your champagne. I'm saying it is, the larger picture is not of an administration that is consolidating power. It is an administration that is crashing in on itself. And you see this in the Trump's popularity numbers, which are in the mid 30s. And people say that's still too many people. Remember that you're always, always, always going to have a reactionary movement is always going to have at least 22% to 25% of the people behind it, for various reasons. But if your floor is 22% and he's at 35, you're not doing real well. And you've got the problem, the crisis of the economy. You've got the crisis of the appointees. You've got the crisis of Trump's own mental acuity. You've got all these things sort of crumbling at the same time or smashing together at the same time. Imagine what it would look like if you had a mentally competent, quite skilled politician doing what, consolidating the kind of power that Trump is doing. It'd be a very different story altogether. So that's out there in this moment as well. Let me see, did I get everything here? Yeah, I think I got everything that you were interested in, at least that I could do in this amount of time. So what would I tell you to watch now? If I were telling you what are the things to watch, I'm watching Trump's brain. First of all, that's the first thing. And second of all, watch what especially the Republicans in the Senate do. That's where the real pressure is starting to ramp up, but there should be a lot more of it. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in that Tennessee special election. Now, a lot of you have asked me to predict what's going to happen going forward. I don't know. We've never been in a moment like this in American history before. But I will tell you this. Now is the time to keep the pressure up. And for the next several months, by the way, when it is time to breathe, I will tell you when it is time to breathe. But right now, the more involved you are at the local level, at the state level, in protests, and those protests are economic as well as political, is supporting your neighbors, all the things that people are talking about doing out there, spreading the word. What needs to happen is more Americans need to understand what is happening and why it matters, and also articulating what we want going forward, because we are not going back to January 19th, 2021. We're just not. But if we're not going to do that, let's make it better. Like, what are the issues that matter to you? I mean, I care about universal health care, but mostly I care about education and journalism. That's where my muscle is going to really go, is into trying to reshape American education. Figure out what your lane is and start getting involved with people who do that. That doesn't mean we have to have all the answers, but it does mean that when we hit the ground running, we want to be able to articulate what we want. And crucially, we want to have people in office who will be able to translate those desires into actual legislation and funding, that's actually quite hard as well. And we haven't talked a lot about that on in this channel, but I will, because articulating what you want is really important. But then electing the people who can pull the right strings is key to making those ideas actually become reality. And those are not the same skill sets. We need both of those sets of people. The people who can best articulate what we want are almost never those people who can figure out how to create coalitions that make them happen. And people often make that mistake of thinking that somebody who articulates a vision very well is going to be able to make it happen. It's just a different skill set, and they can't do it. And similarly, sometimes you want those invisible workhorses because they know which buttons to push to get enough people on board to make something happen. So going forward now, keep up the pressure and don't get discouraged. What is happening is horrific. Don't forget that ever, because that's really important that we keep that naivete, if you will, to care deeply about our humanity and our laws. But while keeping that in mind, it's important to remember that the larger picture is one in which this administration is under enormous stress, and the momentum is on the side of those people pushing back against it. And the more voices we have in this, in whatever way you are comfortable speaking up, the better chance we have of both getting rid of those oligarchs who are trying to destroy the United States, but also of building something on the other side that more adequately addresses the larger needs of the American people, which is, after all, the point of a democracy. So I actually kind of took the day off today, because for once it felt like I wasn't the only one who was keeping tabs on this administration and really pushing hard. Now it turns out I do have something to say, but now is not the time to despair. To the contrary, this is the time really to bear down and recognize that time and the ravages of age and of stupidity are on the side of American democracy right now. They're really helping us out. Trump's not going to get better. These guys are not going to suddenly become more competent at their jobs. The economy is not suddenly going to miraculously recover. And we are increasingly getting our muscle behind us. Anyway, so this is the talk I do about modern politics and history, and that is different than what I do on Thursdays in the middle of the day. This is about modern politics and questions that people have asked and their historical roots. Let me tell you a couple of things. First of all, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer when I do these. And second of all, you are really getting me off the cuff because it's grading season. My grades are due Thursday. midday, and so I have been knee deep in the 19th century for 2 days now, and I'm just kind of going to wing this. So we'll see how it goes. All right, terrific. So let me get to your questions. I usually do 4. There's a 5th one that came in at the last second today that I wanted to address first, just because I've gotten a lot of questions about this, and I had not thought to talk about it here, but I think it's probably not a bad idea. And that is, Rana Olk asked me about people who imply or say outright that both my newsletters and my views are biased on the liberal side. And that's a really interesting question. And what should people say to that? And I would say something probably that you're not going to expect to hear. And that is that, interestingly enough, when I began my career, I was perceived as being conservative, too conservative. And of course, now people are complaining that I'm too liberal. The reality is that I'm a historian. I don't identify with either political party, although I would love to tell you the history of both political parties, because they're very different and they do very different things. But one of the things that you should think about when people talk about modern politics today is, do they have any facts to back them up? Now, I was reared and trained to argue. I went to a high school where all we did was argue. That was the whole point of being in a classroom, and nothing in the world makes me happier than arguing ideas. I mean, really getting into the nitty gritty, the who said this, what does the document say, what's here? And I don't take that at all personally. Like my friends and I argue for fun. This is what we do, not in our personal lives, but literally our idea of a good time is to fight about, what democracy means, what liberty means, and we pull out documents and we fight about things like that, because that's our happy place. So when I'm talking about this material, I'm personally invested in American democracy, but in terms of making arguments, I'm personally invested in the argument, in can I prove this? Do I have the facts? And recently I did a letter that talked about the facts behind what different groups, including the Senate, including the Mueller report, including our intelligence communities, had said about Russian interference in the 2016 election. I had all the supporting documents. I quoted directly from those documents. And somebody wrote to me and said, "You're nuts. You should be reading the real documents." And I sat there and thought, that's not an argument. You're repeating what you hear on Fox News. I have the actual documents. They're right here. I quoted those documents. Now, if you don't think I'm quoting the right places, show me. Let's talk about that. But so one of the things I would urge you to do is look and see if people can marshal actual documents, not just say, you should check the documents. Actually check the documents, because if I am misrepresenting them, I am doing so inadvertently, and I would love to be corrected on those things. Now, that being said, do you want to hear what a true conservative, like a 19th century conservative, would say about the kind of things that I talk about in American politics? And I actually often operate from the perspective of a 19th century conservative, because we are in such a radical place right now. But what they are really concerned about is liberty, is the idea that you don't want to have a large government that squashes individual ability to do things. And that's a real concern. And you hear that from real people who are engaging, conservatives, true conservatives who are engaging with the idea of active government. You hear them saying, people should be free to choose their own health care. People should be free to run their businesses the way they want. People should be free to starve if that's what people want to do. That is an argument that personally I think goes too far. And there's a history behind that theory that I think is really helpful for this moment. And that's that really when we talk about liberty, a historian wrote quite a famous article gave a speech, and it became an article in 1958, in which he talked about positive liberty and negative liberty. And most recently, Ibram Kendi has picked up that story to talk about freedom to do something versus freedom from something. And that, I think, is kind of a good way to think about the way we are right now, in that a lot of people, like, for example, Rand Paul today, or or pretty much anybody on the GOP side, is talking constantly about how certain people should have freedom to do things. They should have freedom to run their businesses the way they want. They should have freedom to have all their money. They should have freedom to behave in a certain way. But that a lot of us look at that freedom to do things and seeing that it is impinging on our freedom from things. So we would like to have freedom to do things, of course, but we would also like to have freedom not to be abused in the workplace, not to be to live in societies that are polluted. So that's one way to think about liberty and liberty to and liberty from, and also to think about what a conservative writer would say today. I will tell you right now, I'm hideously disappointed at the quality of discourse right now on what passes for the conservative side. I mean, Ben Shapiro is not a thinker. Dinesh D'Souza is an idiot. I mean, I'm sorry, I take him on Twitter. He doesn't have any facts. He's making it up because he wants attention. There are good, strong conservative arguments to be made on many of these issues. The problem is nobody's making them. And the problem is right now we are so far to the right that they don't have any traction. Now, if we swung way over to the left, you could make a lot of these arguments, and I'd probably be the one making them. So anyway, that's one way to look at what I'm doing here. And also, again, you don't have to, nobody has to like what I'm saying. I'm thrilled when people don't like what I'm saying, but don't come at me with you're an idiot, you're a libtard, you're a feminist, you're any of these ad hominem attacks, because that doesn't say anything. Come at me with these documents prove you're wrong. And convince me that those documents matter more than the documents I have, or the speeches I have, or the laws I have, or the court decisions I have. Because I'm a historian, we keep the records. I want to see the records. I don't want to hear, well, Sean Hannity says. I don't care what Sean Hannity says. I want to care what documents Sean Hannity is building from, which is one of the reasons it was such a shame that we lost Shep Smith from the Fox News channel, because he was a real reporter. Like, he had his own spin on things, but he actually fact-checked. And of course, we don't really have that any longer. All right. So people are asking, I just saw about the conservative viewpoint. As many of you know, I got into the modern day stuff I do by studying the conservative point of view. So, and I teach the conservative point of view, so I can certainly talk about those things. Just modern America right now is not in that moment. My books talk about that, and I hope to, I'm actually starting a new book, and I hope to be talking about that a lot in that book, but that's not, in terms of modern politics, that doesn't obtain really right now. All right, so again, look for the documents and argue. Look for the documents and say, God, she's totally wrong on what the Supreme Court was doing in this decision. Because what they're really doing is this, I'm all over that. And that to me is fun. That's not personal. What is personal is, I don't like what you're saying, therefore you're an idiot, not that you're wrong. And that's what I'm trying to do in all these talks and all the writing and all that, is get us back to a world where we discover truth by arguing reality, not by saying, I don't like you, therefore you must be wrong. All right, so let me get into what the other questions you guys talked about today, because some of these are really interesting. And as I say, I really am not going to do as thorough a job as I normally do, because I have been reading some really terrific student exams and papers. But Tina Mottram wants to know about the Supreme Court's oral arguments this morning, which were absolutely fascinating. So which I listened to, obviously. So what's at stake? And by the way, in that, I actually listened to Neil Katyal and George Conway, one on the left, one on the right, reacting in real time to what the justices were saying. And they, of course, have both argued before the Supreme Court. So that was really very interesting. But what went on today in the Supreme Court's hearing is, and let me just explain what that means. The Supreme Court decides whether or not to take cases based on whether or not they feel that this is a case that's appropriate for the Supreme Court. And then they get briefs, why they call them briefs is beyond me, because they're not brief, but they get briefs and they read them, and then they actually have conversations with lawyers about what's at stake in that case. And that's what happened this morning. The people who had a stake in the cases, that there were 3 cases before the Supreme Court in this, it was supposed to be 2 hours, it ran over in this short space of time. had a conversation with the justices about the issues at stake in the case. Now the justices will go and have a discussion tomorrow. Apparently, traditionally it's done over lunch, and obviously they're not doing that. They will discuss tomorrow in order of seniority what their decision is about these cases, and then the Chief Justice will decide who's going to write that up. There may be more than one opinion written up, and then that decision will be handed down, usually in June. They're running a bit late now, but at least Conway and Katyal thought that they were so bound by tradition that they would try and have it out by June. So that decision will come out in June. So that's what happened today, is they talked about, by the way, I have to say hi to my student who just came on. Hey, Costa, miss you. They will go ahead and decide that case, and we will know by June what they have decided. So we don't know what they're going to decide. But let me tell you what it looked like to legal observers. And it's interesting because that looked different in the papers when I read about it afterward. So the cases have to do with congressional oversight of the president and state oversight of the president. And there are three separate cases. The first one was that the House Oversight Committee is looking into Trump's finances because, and this is a little bit in the weeds, but if you remember Stormy Daniels, the adult film actress, there was a hush money payment of $130,000 to her, and that should have been declared in Trump's financials, and it was not, and therefore there's reason to be suspicious of that he's broken federal elections law, and I might tell you a little bit more about that down the road. But anyway, they're looking at that, and now there's another case as well. Congress is also trying to get a number of House committees have subpoenaed. Not Trump himself, but have subpoenaed Trump's accountants, Mazars and his banker Deutsche Bank, for his financial records for about 8 years going back, but also those of his children and his grandchildren. And the reason for that is because they are investigating the possibility that the Trump organization has been laundering money for a number of people, but largely for the Russians. And there's a lot of kind of red flags over the Trump the Trump businesses and the possibility of money laundering. They work in real estate, which is there was a loophole in one of the after 9/11 I can't remember the name of it. There's a loophole that makes it possible that you don't have to report large amounts of money transactions out of you have to on almost everything, but not out of real estate. I keep thinking the Homeland Security bill, and that's not it. Patriot Act, the Patriot Act. There we go. So there, Don Jr. is on record a couple of times saying that a lot of their money is coming in from Russia. There's a lot of things that kind of have raised red flags about that. So a number of House committees have asked for those records, and that's why they have subpoenaed not just the president's records, but also those of his children and his grandchildren, because apparently money laundering often involves multi-generational stuff. I don't know, not a banker. This is what I read. Okay, so there are those two House committees, and the question is, are they allowed to do it? Like, is this okay? And what the president's lawyer, for the Congress to be overseeing the president in this fashion, to be issuing these kind of subpoenas. And the president's lawyers have taken two tacks on that, from my reading of it. One is that no, first of all, the answer is no, that the Congress can't oversee the president. First of all, because it's illegitimate for Congress to look into anything that is not directly related to its constitutional duties, i.e., that is, that the Congress has to only investigate things that have to do with the possibility of writing legislation. And that what they are doing here is actually trying to get involved in law enforcement, and that's not part of Congress's duty. So that's one angle on which the president's lawyers have said they can't do it. And the second angle is to say that they can't investigate the president in such a way that they're going to to cross into his duties, and they're going to kind of gum up the work so they take too much of his time. And that argument really obtains to the third case, and that is that of the New York prosecutor is also going after the same kind of financial legislation. I'm sorry, the same kind of Trump's finances that the other House committees are going after, because they too are looking into money laundering, especially. And the argument against the states being able to do that is that can be essentially harassment. That somebody can harass the president again and again and again simply by throwing subpoenas at them, and basically they can spend their entire term doing nothing but answer criminal cases or civil cases, and therefore neither one of these sets of subpoenas is legitimate according to the president's lawyers. This did not go well for the president's lawyers today in front of the Supreme Court, pretty clearly, and the reason for that is that there's precedent for each of these things. First of all, we know, thanks to the 1973 memo from the Department of Justice, and it's just a memo, it's not a law, it's never been tested in court. There's this memo that says that a president can't be indicted for a criminal activity when sitting in the White House, that it gives you protection. And the argument behind that was that if the president is busy defending himself from a criminal suit, he's going to end up spending all of his time doing just that, and we're not going to have a president. So that was the argument behind that initial 1973 memo that was during the Watergate crisis, of course, and it was an attempt to protect Richard Nixon. But this is not a question about criminal activity. And by the way, that's why Robert Mueller didn't ever entertain whether or not Trump had committed any kind of crimes, because he couldn't do that under his, he was operating within the Justice Department. All right, so there is, though, precedent for whether or not the president does have to answer to subpoenas in both of these questions. And the first, obviously, was Nixon. Nixon in 1974 went before the Supreme Court saying that he did not have to turn over his records from the Oval Office, his tapes from the Oval Office, because they were protected by executive privilege. And that case actually didn't come up today. I mean, that case came up, but executive privilege didn't come up, because what they're really talking about is not stuff that happened during Trump's administration, but before his administration. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Nixon had to hand over his personal tapes. Now again, interestingly enough, from a historical standpoint, many people don't know this. I sound like Trump, but many people don't know that, in fact, the judges did not rule that he had to hand over everything. Only a very limited number of tapes, and a number of, finally many years after he died, they went through the courts that, in fact, he did not have to turn over, and his estate, who's dead, his estate didn't have to turn over, I think it's like 800 hours of tapes that were considered personal, because he actually wore a personal taping system. In addition to the systems in the Oval Office, he wore a personal taping system that was voice activated. And a lot of that was really quite personal stuff. It was also noise, toilet flushing or whatever, but it was also personal musings, especially as his life unraveled. And a judge listened to those and said, these are personal, nobody has any interest in these, and the estate can have them to do what to do with as they wish. And the idea originally was to destroy them. I don't know if that happened. But anyways, that being said, he did have to hand over the relevant tapes, but not everything. So the reason I make that point there is, first of all, because it's cool, and second of all, because it means that that it's possible to have to give up some of your stuff and still preserve your personal autonomy. That you really don't want to have a president who can't keep secrets. I mean, literally is not allowed to keep secrets, because that's just not a healthy mental state. Think about your own lives. You don't want the entire world to have access to your diary or to the angry letter you wrote to your second grade teacher or whatever. So it is possible to say, yes, you do have to hand over these files, but you don't have to hand over these files. And that was a distinction that was set up in beginning in 74. But then it ended, I think it was like in 1998, I think was the final decision. I don't remember, because like I say, I couldn't really check anything today. All right, so there was also the 1997 decision about Bill Clinton, whether or not he had to answer to civil litigation and from litigation from before he became president. That was the Paula Jones case. And the Supreme Court in both of these cases decided unanimously that the president did have to step up to the plate and did have to answer these subpoenas. And in fact, in that case, the Supreme Court put some rules around what exactly, how much the president had to do and what was considered harassment of a president. And they decided it was mostly like you couldn't force the president to sit for weeks of depositions. So Clinton got to choose when he had a deposition. Unfortunately, during that deposition, he committed perjury. He committed perjury in the Paula Jones case about Monica Lewinsky, and that gave birth to the Monica Lewinsky scandal. But in both of those cases, the Supreme Court decided unanimously. And in these particular cases, Trump looks like he's got a much weaker position, as in, it's hard to argue that making his accountants, Mazars, turn over his finances is any kind of burden on him. Nobody's asking him to go through his files. It has nothing to do with him. So that's hard to make that burden case. Now, that being said, on its face, according to Conway and Catchall, these should be clear. They seem to feel that the Supreme Court was going to decide pretty emphatically against President Trump in these cases. I'm reading around. I'm not a lawyer. I've certainly never argued before the Supreme Court. The law might be very clear. I think the political angle here is maybe going to have more weight than those two lawyers have given credit for it, given it credit. I will say that if, in fact, the Supreme Court decides in favor of Trump, I think the only message that we will be able, we'll have to read the decision. The arguments are really not strong at all. To the point that literally when the president's lawyer was asked about the Watergate and the Clinton precedents, why those shouldn't obtain, he said, well, they're just too recent to be precedents. That, it's no argument. I could make that argument, but it's no argument. Anyway, all that, probably more than you wanted to know about that stuff, but it's very interesting. And like I say, one more reminder, I'm not a lawyer. This is my reading of this, looking at it as a historian. And somebody might come up and go, oh my God, you've gotten this wrong, this wrong. Not my field of expertise. I did the best I could with that one. There's a couple other things here, and that's about the court, and that people are interested in the court. And so let me answer these. Lisa Easterling is interested in the long-term consequences of the administration leaving a Supreme Court that leans to the right. How long will we recover? And adjoined to that is the question, can Justice Brett Kavanaugh be removed from office? All right, a couple of things about that. First of all, this is not the first time in history that we've had a Supreme Court that has gone way far to the right. The Justice Taney Court before the Civil War obviously went that direction, and so did the Melville Fuller Court in the 1890s, 1900s. And in both cases, there was an issue at heart that I think Chief Justice Roberts is very aware of, and that's that when they went, if you will, off the deep end in one direction, the reputation of the court suffered terribly, terribly. And you don't want to be the Supreme Court justice who is the one who sends this court into the ground for a generation. So that's very much on the case, and that very much on people's minds. So if you're thinking about that in conjunction with these court decisions, how did those extremist courts change? Well, they changed. The thing I like to look at is they changed similarly. They were also strongly to the right in the 1920s, and they changed under FDR when, first of all, he threatened to pack them. There's nothing in the Supreme Court in the Constitution that says we have to have a certain number of Supreme Court justices. It's fluctuated throughout our history. So he goes in and he goes, you guys are all old. You have too big of a caseload. I'm just going to add some more justices. And there's a huge backlash against him doing that. And of course, it didn't happen. But what it did was it kind of signaled to the Supreme Court that it was time to get its act together and pay attention to the real world. So that's out there. Let me say a couple other things about the Supreme Court. You have to remember that 4 of the justices on the Supreme Court were appointed by presidents who did not win the popular vote. George W. Bush put 2, 3 actually, but George W. Bush put 2 on, 2 sitting that are there now, and so did Trump. So 4 of those people were put on by presidents who did not win the popular vote. And that's a problem because they don't reflect the popular will at the time. So they're already out of step. And that's something that I think is going to exacerbate what I just talked about, the difference between the way they decide and the way the American people are. So there's going to be pressure, I think, extra pressure on the Supreme Court on, if the country continues to regain its majority away from the current Republican Party. So that's an issue. There are ways to get rid of Supreme Court justices, and the obvious way is to impeach them. That being said, we do not in America, or we are not supposed to impeach for political reasons, only for law-breaking or incapacity to fill a position. So the thing that strikes me about Kavanaugh, and I was talking to somebody else about this is not just from me, the thing about Kavanaugh is there are a lot of questions about his finances that were never answered. And it would be my guess that when and if we get a Democratic Senate, they're going to ask some of those questions. And that, I think, is not going to go terribly well I mean, I'm not going to make predictions here, but if those questions were easily answered, why weren't they? And so that, I suspect, is hanging out there if the Senate becomes Democratic and if the House stays Democratic. But in terms of the other justices that President Trump has put in and everybody else has, if they're doing their job, like I say, like if they've got the documents and they're doing their job, that's okay. The issue is if they're there corruptly and if they're behaving corruptly. And I think that's the real question going forward. And that is the same for Democrats as well, Republicans and Democrats both. If they're on the court because they have been put there illegitimately, then they should come off the court. But if you just don't like their decisions because they're too far to the right or too far to the left, that's kind of how the system works. So that's the answer to the question of that. All right, so here's another one. Stella Blue, I'm changing here to the next question. Stella Blue has asked, why did AG Barr expose the Department of Justice to unprecedented scrutiny by dropping the Flynn case when Trump could simply pardon him? Another question that goes along with this, kind of the fun of it, is grabbing all these questions and putting together. Terry Panages, I think, says, I'm worried about Obamagate, and I think Trump may be planning an investigation or even arrest of President Obama in order to fire up the Q nut jobs and fire up his base. Could this be a possibility? And Linda Apgar, and Linda, if you're related to Dr. Apgar, that's so cool, said, it seems to me that the GOP is working to strengthen the unitary executive in the extreme and doing so by busily filling vacant federal judgeships with like-minded candidates, as it's already done with the Supreme Court. This could render Congress useless and create an authoritarian regime. Is this something to be concerned about? And by the way, I'm paraphrasing these, so if these people sound like an idiot, it's me, not them, if I'm putting the words badly. And Stephanie Daughtry said, can I talk about the purging of career officials at the FBI, the CIA, and the Justice Department, and how that has to do with Attorney General William Barr dropping the charges against Michael Flynn after he admitted guilt, and the implications of that and what can be done to keep us from going down the road to autocracy. And the reason that I put these together is because they all speak to the same point. The reason I think that Attorney General Barr has asked, and it's not done yet, of course, a judge has to sign off on this, and so far that's not happened, and it's not clear that it's going to happen. The Attorney General, actually it wasn't him who signed the paperwork, it was his protege Timothy Shea, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. The reason he did that, I think, the reason he asked to drop the charges was not about the Flynn case, I think it was political, and that's my read on the situation, because what they are really trying to do, and what Attorney General Barr is trying to do, and he is working he has strongly politicized the Department of Justice, and he is clearly working for President Trump. What he has tried to do with President Trump is to delegitimize the FBI, the intelligence agencies, and career officials, especially career officials in the Department of Justice, the people who preserve our nonpartisan rule of law. And what they were doing with the, I think, with the Barr, with the change in the Flynn case, was to try to delegitimize altogether the investigation into the Russian attack on American democracy in the election of 2016. Now, as I wrote a few days ago, there is no dispute with anybody who's actually looking at the facts that Russia intervened in the 2016 election. There is no dispute, including among Republicans in the Senate. I mean, this happened. I mean, the facts are there. I've read the facts. They're there. The dispute was originally whether or not it swung the election altogether. And of course, that's kind of where Trump started on this, is it didn't matter because it didn't happen and it didn't swing the election. But where this has devolved to is that so many members of the Trump administration were implicated in that relationship, and it was a huge fight over the word collusion. There is no legal definition of collusion, which is why Mueller wouldn't talk about it. The special counsel Robert Mueller wouldn't talk about it. And what Mueller argued was that he could establish that the Russians wanted Trump to be elected, and Trump wanted Russian help, meaning the Trump campaign. I'm using the word Trump as shorthand for the Trump campaign. But while there was a lot of contact between the two, he could not establish that they were working hand in glove. He didn't say that they weren't. He said there was he implied there were facts to say they were, but that he didn't have enough to make a criminal charge on that front. And in part because people refused to speak to him. So what we're really getting at now is, was that entire investigation legitimate? And that's what people argue about when they talk about the Steele dossier, which is a moot point. I've written on this ad infinitum, but the investigation of Russian involvement in that campaign did not begin with the Steele dossier, which, by the way, did not begin with the Clinton campaign either. It was standard Oppo research, actually from a Republican on Trump, a Republican who was backing somebody else, Matt Cottonetti down in Washington there. They're arguing about whether or not that investigation was legitimate. Now, that's been investigated repeatedly, including by the Department of Justice, whose Inspector General looked into it and said, yeah, this was absolutely legitimate. And then he went on to say, but oh boy, the repeated FISA applications having to do with wiretapping Carter Page, those were not okay. You guys really screwed up on that front. And the Department of Justice the FBI came back and said, you're right, we screwed up. But the Inspector General said, no, this was a totally legitimate investigation. Now Attorney General Barr said, I don't buy that. And he appointed his own different inspector who's out there still, and that's John Durham, and he's the U.S. attorney, I think it is, for Connecticut. He's out trying to drum up evidence that, in fact, the investigation was illegitimate. So how does this whole thing with Flynn fit in? The premise on saying his lying to the FBI didn't matter was saying the investigation itself was illegitimate. All right, so that's the next leap here into Obamagate, into this weird thing that people are talking about now, this Obamagate thing that Trump yesterday couldn't define what it was. And that is this ill-defined, Trump said it's the worst thing ever done to a president and all that. I think the direction they're going with that is that the investigation into Trump was part of a deep state, illegitimate, whatever. And the entire investigation was illegitimate. And that erases, if you will, everything we know about the Mueller investigation, about Flynn's cooperation with the Russians, about Don Jr. I mean, all that, the volumes and volumes on the relationship between Russia and the Trump campaign and then the Trump administration. Now, when I first started writing about this, where I really thought this was going, and I still think it's going there to some degree, was in the Trump administration's removal of sanctions on the Russian oligarchs, which are in place in part because of the death of Magnitsky, who was trying to uncover what Putin was doing. It's called the Magnitsky Act, which imposed some sanctions, but also partly Obama put sanctions onto Russian actors and expelled Russians from America, if you remember. Because of the intervention in the 2016 election. And so one of the things that the Russians have wanted very badly, and that the Trump administration has been talking about from way early on, is the removal of those sanctions. And you can see this again and again and again. You know, I write about it, I throw it in, Putin sending COVID equipment to America recently, and that was all the equipment was made by one of the companies that's been sanctioned. So that was actually technically illegal. Him talking with Trump about how the countries worked together during World War II, talking about how we should get along better. All of that, to my mind, is working toward let's get rid of those sanctions, because there's a whole heck of a lot of Russian money that can't move around because of U.S. sanctions on the oligarchs. So that's where I thought it was going. And then I started reading about the things that people like Jim Jordan are saying, Representative Jordan from Ohio are saying, and Trump, of course, tweeting, and Devin Nunes talking about actual prosecutions of people who engaged in Obamagate. And that has me terribly concerned. And this is the question, will they go after Obama? No, I don't think they'll go after Obama. I think that would look crazy enough that people would go, oh, come on, you can't really prosecute a president, not least of the fact that if in fact Trump ever gets out of office, they're going to go, somebody could go after him too. But I'll tell you, those lower people on the totem pole, including Lisa Page and Peter Strzok, who are Trump constantly hammers on those guys. If I were them, I would be very nervous, because I do not like the way this language is going. And you're right, whoever mentioned that. This has been all over QAnon for months. And QAnon finally feels like it's going to see arrests here. And boy, I tell you, they are there for it if you're following QAnon at all. All right. So, what's next? Okay, so I'm going to have to go a little bit quickly now, because I do like to finish on time. And this was a one that probably there's more things that you might be more interested in, but I love this so much I had to answer this. And that's from Tina Rivera, who said, after watching Trump attack an Asian CBS reporter yesterday, I also note how people I knew are making off-color comments about Asians as well, uncharacteristically. I remember the attacks on the Chinese who worked on the railroads and the Japanese Americans placed in internment camps. Can you expand on this? And Pauline Francis added, regarding China as a source of COVID-19, can you talk about the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Chinese experience in America colors Trump's use of this history to support his latest conspiracy theories, and Obamagate being part of a Chinese story? And so, yes, I would love to do this, because although it's very little known, I have threatened for a long time to write a history of the Chinese in America in the late 19th century, and this is really dear to my heart, this whole issue, and I will try not to get too excited about it, just cause. All right, so the Chinese in America is an incredibly cool story, both politically, economically, and culturally. And I'm not really going to have time to go into the cultural stuff, which breaks my heart. I'll try and get a little bit to it. So remember that the Chinese miners come to America in 1849 during the First Opium War, which has just destroyed China. And what that means is they're desperate for money. They can't legally emigrate from China. So they come over to work in California in the mines. And very quickly they are discriminated against in those mines. And one of the things that's interesting about the Chinese history in America in this period is that There's no Chinese in this period. There certainly is, there's an area in the world, but the Chinese who come over don't see themselves as a unified group at all. They speak different languages, they have different cultural practices, but they come to America, and Americans say, oh, you're Chinese, and that creates this concept of the Chinese American. And so they come and they begin to work in the mines, and they are quickly pushed out of the fresh mines. And you know what, I'm going on too long about this. Anyway, the white miners, because it's great stuff, but the white miners get furious, not only at the Chinese miners, but also at the Mexican miners and the Indian miners who are also there, and the Chilean miners they're furious about. But the Chinese miners, they quickly, in 1852, pass a law. They actually passed two laws, but there's only one that really matters for my purposes today. It's called the Foreign Miners Tax, and what it does is it whacks the Chinese, and the Mexicans, by the way, but it whacks the Chinese with a higher tax on the stuff that they pull out of the mines. And in 1854, the 2 years after the Chinese miners tax, there's a legal case in which a white man is convicted of murdering a Chinese, and he gets off by saying that Chinese people shouldn't be able to testify against white people in court. That's what the laws say, and therefore I'm not convicted here of being murdering, and he gets away with that. So what you have by 54 is a circumstance in which Chinese people in America are not allowed to testify in court. And as I've said here before, if you can't testify in court, you're done. You're done. Anybody can do anything to you, and you can't protect yourself because you can't have your day in court. This, by the way, is why it always upsets me when people complain about jury duty, because there is literally nothing in your life that is more important than your right to be in a courtroom and to hear your peers, or to have your peers hearing what you have to say. And it may be boring, but let me tell you, a lot less boring would be if somebody takes that away from you and you have to do whatever a court says without any of your people like you on that court. And if you don't think I'm right, man, you start listening to some of the kangaroo courts, where people just have to sit there and be berated and then be sent to death. And that, anyway, I'll stop. Okay, so the Chinese are discriminated against by the mid-1850s in America. And this is a huge issue, actually, in the reworking of America after the Civil War, when in fact the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment go into place. They're a problem for the West, because Westerners don't much care about African Americans, because there really aren't very many African Americans in the West, but there are a lot of Chinese in the West. And so a number of states refuse to approve the 14th and the 15th Amendments until they are certain that Chinese are not included in that. And that's one of those dirty little secrets that a lot of people don't know about. And they end up discriminating against Chinese in state and local laws in the West under a provision from the 1802 laws back east, where there's a rule that equality only applies to people who are people who become citizens, the only people eligible for citizens are people who are free and white. And that, they say, knocks out the Chinese in the West. So you have that in the 1870s, and then in 1871 you get well, actually it's earlier than that. In 68, you have the 68 and 71, that thing going into effect. But in 68, you have a treaty between America and China called the Burlingame Treaty, which is this fascinating treaty, which is designed to move the bulk of world trade from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It doesn't end up doing that, but from 68 onward, you have in place this idea of cooperation between America and Asia, and theoretically they're going to be exchanging people and ideas after that. But this doesn't go very well on either side, and after the Union Pacific Railroad is completed in 1869, you get a depression in California. And when that depression hits in California, people turn on the Chinese, who come off the railroads where they've been working and come back into the cities. And there's this rising tide of anti-Asian sentiment. And by 1878, 1879, You have a guy named Dennis Kearney in California who basically just wants the people in charge of San Francisco to fix the roads because he's a drayman and his potholes mean he can't move stuff around like he should. And at first he tries to work with the Chinese, but he quickly realizes that he gets far more political traction if he has this tagline, "The Chinese must go." And so he starts to say that everything will be just ducky for white people if you can get rid of the Chinese. And by 1879, James G. Blaine and the Republican Party signs on to that. And by 1882, we get the Chinese Exclusion Act, which says that no Chinese workers can come to America. Scholars can, and business people can, and diplomats can, but Chinese workers can't come to America. And that's not going to be overturned until 1943 during World War II, when Chinese people go to Congress and say, or to their neighbors and say, you know, we're on your side in this war, and it might be nice if you actually treated us that way. And so that's when we get rid of the Chinese Restriction Act in 43. But how does this, and it's killing me how much I can't talk about here, because of course I didn't talk at all about Chinese women, and there's a reason that Americans have exoticized, if you will, Chinese women. Think for example of Kung Fu, that TV show, and you know what, I can't do it now. Too bad. Killing me. But why do we care about this now? We care about this now because obviously Donald Trump is tying into old tropes, old anti-Chinese tropes, when he blames China for the COVID virus. But not just that, because China becomes a real bugbear for Americans in 1949 when it goes communist. And so communist China becomes, certainly for people who grew up in the 60s like me, you know, there were always these pictures of these Chinese sort of masses of people in their uniforms and all that. And so that's something that he's tapping into in an older population, the baby boomers and older, who remember that. Now, that being said, China hid the fact that they had this disease. I mean, remember, they were not forthcoming about that. And similarly, the World Health Organization, WHO, was trying to work with China. So it's kind of trying to cheer them on. So they did not call out China early on, but that's kind of understandable for the WHO because it had to work with China. He is correct that China was hiding what was really going on. Mind you, we are now hiding what's going on. He is now hiding what's going on. And that's a hallmark, at least in the Chinese case, of a repressive society where you don't want information to get out. And one of the reasons that I'm so adamant about information getting out is because you got to make laws based on reality, or things happen like this. We get world pandemics and hundreds of thousands of people die. You know, I would much rather have my president or my leader say, hey, we got a real problem, we have to deal with X, and be able to deal with it, rather than having them say, no, nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong. Oh, and by the way, we're going to lose 100,000 people. So definitely they are hitting on that, and they are trying to tie Joe Biden and I think his son to China, and to say that they are part of a larger Chinese conspiracy. We'll see whether or not that takes hold. Now, that being said, there's something really interesting happening right now in the Republican Party with regard to China. And that is, there are a number of Chinese hawks, people who hate China, or I shouldn't say that, but who are anti-cooperation with China, who are anti-cooperation with China on intellectually principled ideas. And if you're interested in this, Matt Stoller, who's himself a Chinese hawk and very into economics, has written a piece on his newsletter called Big about this. And what he talks about is how some of these Chinese people, anti-Chinese people like Marco Rubio and like Cotton, what's his name, Cotton from Arkansas, Tom Cotton from Arkansas, they don't like China, but they're also populists. So what they have been saying is that the growth and power of China is intimately connected to American financiers. And in the effort to get around American financiers and to break the monopolies of them and the dominance of China, that they want to see much more emphasis on American manufacturing of things like supply chains. So, and that's not an illegitimate criticism. The fact that we could, you know, our supply chains are based largely in Asia right now has made us very, very vulnerable in some ways now. So they're taking that anti-Chinese xenophobia, if you will, and saying, hey, let's let's reorganize our economy in such a way that we break up the power of big finance and create supply chains here at home. And I think that's one of the most interesting intellectual developments in the Republican Party in 20 years, at least. So that's something worth watching. But you have to really be in the weeds to know it's there. I mean, I've not seen anybody but Matt Stoller talking about it. And it may be one of those sort of flash in the pan new ideas. There's always some new idea coming up that everyone thinks is, you know, the cat's meow, and then you never hear about it again. But that one made me sit up and take notice. So that's kind of why I chose to do China. Okay, I have one more thing to talk about today because I'm almost out of time. And that is Kim Flowers Evans has asked, do I see a return to an FDR New Deal era after this pandemic, after Trump and after this pandemic, to help us get out of the recession/depression we're headed for? Bobby Jack Miller has said, if the GOP is able to steal the election and re-elect their president, how easy will it be for them to dismantle the Constitution and rule of law so completely that we will never live in a republic again? And Susan Bates wants to know why I concluded last Tuesday with the turnaround of the nation in 1932, what would the change look like that I was talking about, and what parallels and differences do we have in the present now that we have foreign interference in elections, the media, gerrymandering, and so on. And I put those all together. And somebody else asked, and I didn't write this down, somebody else asked, are they correct to hear that I am more discouraged in my writings than I have been? So let me start sort of with the last thing first. I believe, and I firmly believe this, that we are standing on a knife edge in America between full-out fascism and a renewal of American democracy. And, you know, people again and again say to me, is there any hope? Is there any hope? Well, if you think I stay up until 4 o'clock in the morning writing 1,200 words a day, which, by the way, is like superhuman, because I'm hopeless, then, you know, I got some really nice land to sell you in Florida. You know, I am, of course there's hope. The future is not written. Tomorrow is not written. Anything can change. And I firmly believe that. For all that I believe in the importance of historical patterns, it is very important that we do not know what's going to happen in the future, and that we can change what's going to happen in the future. So am I discouraged, more discouraged than I have been? I think that Trump and his people are working very hard to consolidate power as quickly as they can, because I think that they recognize that that the walls are closing in. This pandemic has badly shaken even Trump's supporters, and the economy is not where it needs to be for him to be reelected. Similarly, I meant to mention this before, why are they so determined to talk about how Russia was not the bad actor in 2016, and for example, Ukraine might have been? I think that they are expecting help from foreign governments, not necessarily just Russia, in order to be reelected, in order for Trump to be reelected in 2016, and for evidence. You know, I keep saying you have evidence. For evidence to that, I point to two things. Bill Barr's statement before Congress during the hearings on the Mueller report, in which somebody said, if a president gets, if a candidate gets foreign dirt in an election, should they go straight to the FBI? And he had a really long pause before he said, if they get information from a foreign intelligence agency, but not from generally a foreigner. And of course, he and his, if you wondered where he went when he was first appointed, he disappeared a lot. He and John Durham were actually going to other countries trying to drum up new information on the on what happened in 2016 from foreign countries, ignoring what our own intelligence agencies have all agreed. And that's just weird. All right, that's just weird. That's not okay. All right, so I think that they are looking for that. And I also think they realize they're in real trouble. I mean, they've spun this out for a long time, and now the walls are closing in. Now, I'm not saying Trump's going to lose at all. We don't know what's going to happen. But I think that they are consolidating power as quickly as they can. So that's what you're reading in my letters, is this concern about this consolidation of power. Do I think the game is over? Absolutely not. If you were living in 1928 or 1929, and I said to you that the Republican agenda was going to be completely destroyed in a matter of months, you would have had me committed. Or if you had talked to me on December 6th of 1941, and I said, this depression is going to be over and America is all going to come together in 4 years, similarly, you would have said I was crazy. And you can see this again and again and again. What needs to happen is that Americans need to step up and to stop saying, oh my God, it's all over. That, by the way, is a key piece of disinformation. When people try and convince you that it's all over and you're done, that's exactly how you keep people from being active. That is a really well-known disinformation technique. Convince people that both sides lie, both sides cheat, there's no point in stepping up, your voice doesn't matter, stay home, and that's how the bad guys win. So you need to step up, and we need to step up and make our voices heard, and that's what I'm doing every night until 4 o'clock in the morning, is stepping up and making my voice heard. So if we were to get a New Deal, what would that look like? Well, actually, I'm going to be mixing up my newsletter to expand it so we can actually have a place to talk about these things as soon as my grading's done. Because I think it could look like a lot of different ways. It could look like a lot of different things. But let's just start with the fact that what we have going on right now in the rescue packages for coronavirus that are having to make it their way through the Republican Senate is a world that has really, really helped out the big players, the industrialists, the conglomerates. My partner was just telling me the other day that Gordon Sondland got money, from the coronavirus packages, which is insane. I mean, he's a billionaire, right? He's the guy who was at the heart of the Ukraine, one of the guys at the heart of the Ukraine scandal. He got money. And the argument behind that is that the world works best when the people at the top who understand how the economy works, who have good connections and all those things, that they're the ones who really matter. They're the ones who have the money. They need to be confident in the government. They need to have faith that things are going to be good. So whenever things get rocky, you help them. And that's precisely what the Republican Party said during the Depression in the 1920s. Again and again and again, they said the reason we're in trouble is because the people with money are not confident in the economy. So we need to cut taxes. We need to drop any kind of regulation. We need to cut budgets. We need to make sure that school teachers make less money and janitors make less money. And we need for regular people, to work harder. Well, we know now that systemically that simply was not possible, that you actually need to have money at the bottom for the economy to recover. So one of the things that I would look at if I got to be king of the universe, or at least king of America, or at least a member of Congress, which, by the way, I don't want to do, is recovery from the bottom. Many other developed countries guaranteed wages, 80% to 90% of wages for people at the bottom. Well, that means that right there erases all of your problems with people not being able to pay their rent, not being able to eat, and that trickles up, if you will, that pushes up. So what would that take? We see people complaining about they need to work to make money, and therefore we have to open society so everyone, who's on the front lines dies. Why aren't they protesting for a basic 80 to 90% income protection through the course of this pandemic? I'm not suggesting that this necessarily is a full-time minimum wage or minimum income thing, which I know people like Wang argued, but things like that are actual discussions we could have. Do you repair society by repairing people at the top? I look at what's happened since the 1980s, and I look at what happened in the 1920s, and I look what happened in the 1890s, and that to me does not look like it works terribly well. Works a lot better if you help people at the bottom in a situation like this. And that's the sort of thing that, what would it look like? I think it looks like people calling their congressmen and writing. And by the way, they do have to keep a tally if you call your congressman. And going to newspapers and saying, where is the help for people at the bottom rather than people at the top? So that's one thing it looks like. But I mean, I could go down a whole list of things that I think you look at this moment and you say that we need, and that we need not out of the goodness of our hearts. And I'm going to give you a very conservative, if you will, leaving where I started, a very conservative argument for that basic wage protection. And I'm going to put on a persona here. I don't care at all about those people at the bottom. I just want to make sure my business doesn't go under. It's a very selfish way to look at things, but that would be a good conservative argument. Similarly, you could make an argument for universal health care based not on the idea that anybody has a moral right to health care, although I think you could certainly make that argument, but based instead on the idea that if people don't have a basic right to health care, things like this happen. We get the spread of a pandemic that kills everybody, whether or not they have health care or not. And by the way, that was the original argument that Teddy Roosevelt had back in the progressive era for protecting public health way back in 1884, that you had to clean up the cities, you had to take care of individuals at the bottom of society, you had to protect their wages, you had to protect their ability to get an education, you had to protect their health, and you had to protect their environment, because otherwise what happened at the bottom levels of society would affect the entire way through society, and everybody would suffer. And Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was drawing on the conservative principles that he had inherited from Abraham Lincoln. So that's probably a good place to end. I've gone on for an hour. I know it was not as well documented as I normally do it, but my grades go in on Thursday, and we can pick it up from there. I hope this was useful. Once again, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer when I do these. And once again, just one more disclaimer. When I do these, some people have suggested that I have a staff here. I do not have a staff. I'm my staff. So just do keep that in mind. If you feel I've gone totally off the rails and missed something obvious, it's because I just came from grading my papers and did not actually have a chance really to do much prep work at all. So that'll be better when the summer goes on, but remember, it's just me. I'm doing the best I can on this. And thank you very much for tuning in. If you thought it was useful, we'll do this again on Tuesday. I initially said I would do 8 of these. I believe this is the 8th. If you like it, I'll keep going. If you feel like you've heard enough, we'll move from there. Thank you very much.